There's room in the front, so if some of you in the back would prefer to move up and have a better seat, you can do that at this time. Good evening, and welcome to Principia College's 10th Monitor Night Live event. This evening is designed as an opportunity for our distinguished panelists to provide their insights on breaking news of the day, at the same time fostering the relationship between Principia and the Christian Science Monitor. Because this is something of an interactive event, audience members are encouraged to ask questions at the end of the discussion. Principia Internet Radio listeners are invited to email their questions to talk.radio@principia.edu. We're fortunate enough to have John Yema, editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and Gail Russell Chaddick, a Washington correspondent, with us here in Cox Auditorium tonight. We'll be joined by 3 Monitor correspondents via webcam later on in the evening. From 1979 to 1989, John Yema served the Monitor as a Washington correspondent, Middle East correspondent, and business editor. Yema spent the next 20 years working for the Boston Globe, where he ran the online news edition and held several different editorial positions, including foreign editor and Sunday editor. In his 35-year career, Yema has written about everything from foreign affairs to economics, science, and culture. He was a Reuter Fellow at Oxford University in 1994 and a Sulzberger Fellow at Columbia University in 2008. Since Mr. Yema rejoined the Monitor as editor in 2008, he has introduced a popular weekly print edition of the paper. Daily news coverage can still be accessed online at csmonitor.com and through daily news briefing emails. Despite recent changes, the Monitor remains committed to honest and unbiased journalism. Mr. Yema will introduce Ms. Russell Chaddick along with the other panelists. As a brief side note, Mr. Yema and Ms. Russell Chaddick will be available to greet the audience on stage following the program. The first 100 audience members will receive an autographed copy of the current issue of the weekly Monitor magazine. The line will form on the organ side of the hall. But for now, please join me in welcoming John Yema and Gail Russell Chaddick.
Thanks, Maya. And you know, those are going to be collector's editions. You want to save them. You want to put them in safe deposit boxes if possible.
That's it.
I could kind of set this up in a lot of different ways, but I thought that because we're at this big moment in the world on a number of different fronts, I'd introduce our panelists by talking about some of the issues that maybe we could concentrate on at first. And so beside me is Gail Russell Chaddick, and Gail covers Congress for the Monitor. And this is a very important moment in Washington because we've had this earthquake of an election, the midterm elections, and now we have a divided Congress, and we have a president who is now negotiating with a House that's under a different leadership and a Senate that is only marginally under his control, but still under the party's control. There are huge economic problems. There's a whole question about how we talk to one another. So I think Gail will concentrate on a lot of what's on the political agenda and on the governmental agenda as we go forward. Gail is a veteran Washington correspondent. She's been a foreign correspondent in France and has also covered parts of North Africa at different times, so France and Europe. And she's also been an editor at the Monitor in Boston. And before that, she was an academic, and was it political science or government?
Political science.
Okay. And then I'm not sure that can we get their images up, but Scott Peterson. Scott, are you on the line?
I am indeed, thank you.
Hey, Scott, how you doing? Scott is in Istanbul, and Scott is probably the Western correspondent who's been into Iran more than any other Western correspondent. He's an expert on Iran. He's an expert on the Middle East, too. And this is a pretty important moment in the Middle East. Scott, we're going to talk to you about Iran, but we're also going to talk to you about what's going on elsewhere. You know, these kind of fires that are burning from Tunisia now into Egypt, the whole question of the reverberation of the Jasmine Revolution, and also look at then Iran, which is, you know, of course, a big security issue for the United States and the West, and also a question of the aspirations of the Iranian people. Scott has been covering the Middle East for a number of years and has been stationed elsewhere for us. I've forgotten, you've been in Afghanistan too, right? So he can.
Sure. I was in Afghanistan, especially in 2001,
Right.
et cetera, and based in Moscow before that.
Right. He can speak to that. He can speak to Iraq also. And Scott, by the way, has a wonderful book called "Let the Swords Encircle Me," which was just published in late last year, and is a look at the course of the Iranian Revolution and the future of the Iranian Revolution now that it's sort of confronting these great questions that about whether it's still a revolution or whether it's ossified in some way. So, Scott, we'll talk about that too. Next, we're going to Bob Marquand. Bob, by the way, the cover story in the currently circulating issue. Hey, Bob, how you doing?
How are you? Good.
Great.
Good to hear you.
The cover story in the currently circulating issue of the Monitor is on really the rise of Germany, and it's a look at Germany in Europe, and there are big, Germany is a success story in Europe, raises questions about whether Europe can work really as a whole, and so we'll talk a little bit about the financial crisis and some of the tensions in Europe, and maybe some of the cultural issues involving, say, the more efficient North and the South, which is indebted and is almost as if there's a rift in Europe now between the North and the South. And so we'll talk about that a bit with Bob. Bob's been in Europe. He's been also our China correspondent. You were in India too, right, Bob?
New Delhi from 97 to 2000.
Right, and he's covered a number of issues, been an editorial writer for the Monitor, so he's a veteran Monitor correspondent. And then joining us from Los Angeles, as last year, is Gloria Goodell. And Gloria is one of our great cultural writers. She knows the entertainment industry, she knows Hollywood, she knows the culture. I thought maybe Gloria, we can talk about anything with her, but I thought one of the things we could really concentrate on is this whole question now of the tone in which we're talking to one another, because she monitors media, right? She monitors how people are talking, and this question of whether discourse has been cheapened or polarized too much by all the shouting that's going on in the media, on TV, talk radio, and elsewhere. So, Gloria, we'll talk about that with you, and then we'll talk about other things too, and you'll tell us about some of the famous stars that you're in contact with. Not that we talk about that too much at the Monitor.
Okay.
So let's do this. Let's go directly to Scott. I think because this is the big news moment in the Middle East. Scott, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Tunisia, what happened in Tunisia, and what you think is happening in Egypt, and how that's playing across the Middle East, the Arab world, and then maybe even a look at other parts of the Middle East, including Iran. Do you have a sense of how this thing is unfolding in Egypt? I mean, is the government likely to fall? What's happening there?
Well, I think that we are witnessing today, especially, an absolutely transformative event in Egypt. I mean, I think every journalist and every analyst in this region has been watching their television screens all day long today. It was declared in Egypt to be a day of rage against the government of Hosni Mubarak, who, of course, has been on the ground for 30 years in Egypt. He's a very significant American ally over there, but people are very, very tired. Egypt is also a very, very poor country. It's the largest country in the Arab world with 80 million people. And for several days now, we've seen a kind of beginning, the beginning of protests going on in Egypt. And today was a day that things really took off. I mean, it was quiet in the morning. Then there were Friday prayers. And we saw people, and this isn't just happening in Cairo. This is happening in a lot of different cities across the country. Right after Friday prayers, people came out and began to protest. And at that exact moment, we also began to see the Egyptian security forces wade in and start basically imposing their zero tolerance policy on the protesters. And so it really was an extraordinary moment because, the first domino to fall, shall we say, took place, just to rewind a little bit, back in mid-December. And protests began in the North African country of Tunisia, not a particularly large one. The United States said some nice things about it, and President Ben Ali had been there for 23 years. Like a lot of these Arab autocrats, he'd been around for an awful long time. People weren't doing particularly well there. But the entire chain of events began when one man, who was a college graduate, decided to protest the fact that police wouldn't allow him to sell produce from his vegetable cart. And this was a college graduate. He couldn't find a job. He was reduced to selling vegetables. And when the police prevented him from selling his vegetables, he immolated himself. He lit himself on fire and killed himself in protest. And that act, which obviously is a pretty visceral, powerful event, is one that has taken hold across the Arab world. And so what we've seen now is, as a result, first of all, several weeks of protests in Tunisia, which resulted in the overthrow of that president in mid-January. And everyone was saying, well, Tunisia is different. We're not going to see these same events going on in other Arab countries, and countries especially like Egypt, for example, are very, very, very solid. And really, we're not going to have those kind of problems. They're stable. In fact, just 3 days ago, Hillary Clinton said Egypt is stable. That's our assessment. Anyway, what we've seen today is a serious cave-in from the president. We've seen violence in the streets. People are amazed. In fact, what was extraordinary were the tens of thousands of people who were protesting on the streets. In defiance of the ban, they burned the headquarters of the ruling party. And finally, after 1 a.m., Cairo time, President Hosni Mubarak, who hadn't said a word for 4 days, everybody was wondering if he'd already flown away. Basically, he just came up, his eyes were red, he was speaking to the cameras, but this is an 82-year-old man who's been president for 30 years of a country that really, it's had its advances for sure, but, of course, the majority of Egyptians live below the poverty line, and they were letting their president know that he needed to go. So he basically caved in to a degree. I mean, this was the event for today. What we've seen is the government is going to be renamed tomorrow. Mubarak is throwing out the government. In his 11-minute speech, this is the only 11 minutes that we've seen of him in 4 days. He said that these protests had to stop, but that he himself wasn't at all responsible for anything. He's basically blaming everybody else. So we'll see if that's enough for the protesters, and we'll see if the kind of changes that we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt are also going to affect other countries where we're also seeing protests. We're seeing protests in Yemen. We've seen some protests in Oman. And, just to conclude, the overall historical import of these events they're so significant. We have not seen this kind of event in the Sunni Arab world for decades, and it's really electrifying this entire region.
A quick follow-up, Scott. I think a lot of people worry when they see instability in the Middle East and they see street protests. Some people want to compare it with velvet revolutions in Europe and elsewhere in the past decade, 2 decades. But the worry is always that there's one faction, and the worry, let's just articulate it, is often that it's the well-disciplined, say, Muslim Brothers in Egypt, or some group that may have more discipline, may be more willing to sacrifice themselves, and may hijack what may be right now a popular revolution. To what extent is that a concern?
Well, remarkably, I think, and I think this has surprised a lot of analysts, is that, in Tunisia, for example, there was very, very little presence of any Islamist groups. I mean, this really did seem to be a real, live, grassroots revolution that really did sweep in all elements of society who were angry. I mean, on the streets in Tunisia, you saw young people, old people, you saw people with jobs, people without jobs. Tunisia has, unlike many of these Arab nations, has a very substantial middle class that's quite well educated. So, on paper at least, they would have appeared to have been the last people to, kind of risen up. Whereas in Egypt, we're seeing also, in terms of the people who are taking part, very little kind of overt Islamic, sensibility. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood has always been the whipping boy, if you will, for the Egyptian government. They blame all problems, blame all opposition, blame all violence on the Muslim Brotherhood. But really, except for the fact that you had people praying in large groups, obviously during Friday prayers, but even several times in the course of the protests yesterday, even when it wasn't normally prayer time, which is kind of surprising, there wasn't an actual overt, Islamist element. Now, and I think that what you're speaking about in terms of the concern will only be realized. It's really going to depend on how the government itself handles itself and reacts to the street protests.
Okay, Scott, let's leave it there. We'll come back to you. And let's go to Bob. Bob in Paris. And it's a little bit of a shift of subject, but we're kind of going around the horn pretty quickly. So we've got this cover story out on the rise of Germany, and you've been monitoring the whole question, the sort of the European Union and the question of where what the split is between the North and the South. Do you see a kind of Germany and the Scandinavian countries and maybe the old Baltic states, do you see them becoming a kind of a new Hanseatic league? They're kind of cohering as their own economic bloc. And what does that say about the future of the European Union? And is that too big a question?
Well, a lot of the people in Europe would say that's too big of a question, and the Germans would not want to be seen as trying to create a northern bloc and a southern bloc, although they're talking about it all the time. We have a lot of creations of new power centers in Europe, partly by the decay of the southern tier as an economic competitor. I think the main point to make is that what you see now in Europe is a significant drift from the Europe that we all grew up with. The pictures in our head, as Walter Lippmann used to say, the Europe of European integration of a single borderless project that would create a zone of human rights, civilizational values, free exchange, and ever greater integration. That project is now in a state of serious drift. Europe doesn't have revolutions. I mean, I have to follow Peterson here and talk about Europe, which is very quiet compared to the Middle East. But some very important fundamental structural changes are taking place. Where Scott is based in Istanbul, Turkey has become a new power center, a new possible power center. The Germans are looking right now at trying to create much more harmony between themselves, Poland, and Russia in a kind of Weimar corridor. Now, we'll see whether that works or not. But there is definitely, in Germany and among the northern tier states, as you point out, there's a feeling that we're the competitive ones. We have the export economies. And in this sense, it's really Germany that has the significant export economy. It exports to Asia now, to the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. But I think what we're seeing is a drift away from the old Europe that was founded on NATO principles, in which France was the diplomat and Germany was the brawn, and the unification of Germany has created a dynamic which is moving the center of gravity of Europe away from the Rhine, away from the Franco-German alliance, and more towards Berlin. I don't know if that's too broad of an answer to your question.
No, that's a great answer.
To your broad question.
Yeah. What do you think, Bob, since you've just written about this for our cover story, sum up what you think the German difference is. What is it that has made Germany such a powerhouse? Is it, they don't have, I mean, they've got natural resources, but they don't have huge amounts of oil or anything like, what is it that makes the difference with Germany right now?
Well, several things. One thing is the fact that they are unified. They spent $120 billion a year for more than a decade, starting in 1989 when the Berlin Wall went down, reunifying. The Treuhandstadt, as it's called, was an enormous project. Infrastructure, roads, the recreation of Berlin. That's one aspect. Another aspect is the fact that Germans make things. That's what they do. They are builders, they are engineers, and they have definitely, around 2001, 2002, they took seriously the concept that there's going to be a new era of Asia rising, and they wanted to be part of an export economy. That's what they do. They make things. And so they put enormous amount of emphasis on what's called the Mittelstand, which is the small and medium-sized companies in Germany, that make niche products. Like for my story, I looked at a solar panel coating company that did solar panel coating that got a greater amount of power out of the solar panel process. But they make parts for cars and up and down the line, cars, chemicals, and machine tools. And they export them to Asia. They build the machines, and these small and medium-sized companies, of which there are maybe 2,000 or so, is half the economy, and they're extremely disciplined. They're very, they're very niche-minded, and they've become very, very tough businessmen. I was speaking to the former American ambassador there recently, who said that he found that the German business attitude has become a lot tougher in recent years. So you've got a combination of things with this export model from Germany, and they are seeing themselves in a new confident light that they haven't expressed before when they were busy building and paying for the rest of Europe. They were the masters of integration. They've done that. They've spent a lot of money. A lot of it is the result of the war, as we know. They had a lot of ghosts to answer for and to reconcile, and they've been trying to do that. So they've taken up a dialogue of we're a normal nation now, and that has just created a kind of new dynamic in Europe. And now, for the first time, we see Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, starting to make rules and make more, to do a little bit more pushing than the Germans, than we're used to seeing the Germans take. Some of my sources basically say Germany, in some ways, has fallen out of love with Europe because Europe was the big romance of the post-war years. But now Germany does not want to pay for what Germany sees as siesta economies, the so-called pigs, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, and Italy. That's created a problem in the German mind. We're working hard. We've done what you always hear, what I heard over and over when I was in Germany a couple months ago. We do our homework, and if you're not doing your homework, the Germans aren't going to be happy paying for you to sit around. What they see is societies that are deciding they don't want to produce as much as they do, and so on. Of course, this has created great internal pressures and a great deal of unhappiness on the part of smaller countries.
Right. Bob, let's hold it there for a second, and let me just permit, since I'm the editor, I get an editorial comment every once in a while. So here's the editorial comment, mostly directed at students, I think. Listen to what we've just heard. We've gone from the Middle East, we've gone to Europe, and we're talking about fairly epical changes that are going on. Bob's just talked about the whole post-war assumption is kind of being looked at anew in Europe, the question of the NATO and the European Union, and we've got the Middle East now rocked by street protests. This is a huge moment in history, and it's happening right before us. So let's go to Gail right now. Gail in Washington, or in Elsah tonight.
Same difference.
The level of intrigue is just amazing here. And so we're coming off of this midterm election, we're coming off of the lame duck Congress, we're coming off of now the Tucson shootings and a number of other things. President Obama's job approval ratings seem to be going up a little bit. The new Congress is in session, meaning a Republican-controlled House and a Democrat-controlled Senate. Is this a new era? And talk to us a little bit about divided government and whether you think that this is a moment where things can get done, or are we just playing for the next election? Are we in a kind of an endless political election cycle?
Well, there's a certain political rationale for elections that says that there's a pendulum going on in American politics, and what the pendulum has just done is, after 42 years of Democrats controlling the House, The Republicans took it back in 95, and then they had 12 years of trying to figure out, for the first time really, none of them that took control back in 95 had any experience with being in the majority. So we had Newt Gingrich and a 12-year experiment, at which time Republicans behaved rather like Democrats. They spent a lot of money, they had earmarks. Instead of getting rid of the Department of Education, which they campaigned to do, they in effect strengthened it, had a stronger federal role. Instead of cutting back entitlements, they created a new one with prescription drug bill. And at the end of those 12 years, they were out of power. In came the Democrats again. And the sense when the Democrats took back power was, well, you know, the natural order has been reasserted. You know, we're back and intend to stay there for a long time. And then there was the summer of 2009, when members went home to their district to say, look what we gave you, a new prescription drug bill. And they were screamed at. And this was, I would say that was the beginning of the revolution. By the time we came to the election a year later, there were not many town meetings. Members were trying new experiments, they told me, like the tele-town meeting. We can see many more constituents that way. Well, it's actually a way of protecting yourself from having a vegetable thrown at you, or, you know, confronting that kind of voter anger. And politicians couldn't understand, what are they angry at? We're giving them something they didn't have before. Healthcare reform. Plus, you know, it's hard times. In hard times, what do people do? They look to the government for answers. But they didn't. And then we had this Tea Party surge, and elections that, you know, the range of competitive seats in any election year. If you say that there are 35 competitive House seats, that's a lot. You have 87 Republicans who took over Democratic seats. I mean, that's just, no one saw that coming. And you have freshmen, 96 in this freshman class, 87 Republicans. Now, what they're supposed to do is be quiet, right? In the Senate, you go for at least a year before you give your maiden speech. And in the House, well, you can go several terms before anyone pays attention to what you have to say. But these freshmen didn't get that memo. They actually think that they have a strong mandate from voters. And you know, a lot of their colleagues think so too. Because they're going to have to face voters in 2 years. And I would say that the other thing that's happening, forget for a minute the political dynamic. All of the things that economists have been warning about for decades now, the baby boomers are going to retire, the debt level is getting higher and higher, this is unsustainable. Well, suddenly the baby boomers are retiring. The debt level is unsustainable. The United States bond rating is in jeopardy. There is a chance that the next bond issue will not be eagerly subscribed by the rest of the world, happy to pick up our debt. And so two things have happened at the same time. There has been a significant political switch that, frankly, the politicians don't know how to figure. They don't really know. The establishment politicians don't understand what happened. And so what you're seeing now on a daily basis is a strong effort to kind of co-opt the new freshman class. You're hearing language like, they're going to have to learn to behave like adults. And the freshman class is saying, I don't think so. And it's a different dynamic. And the other thing that I think is extremely interesting about this period is when you have had switches like this in the past, like when the Republicans took over in '95, it was about a full year before anything really big happened, you know, a face-off with President Clinton over the budget. And, you know, dealing at the time with, by today's standards, fairly small disagreements. This freshman class, as early as the 4th of March, is going to have to make a decision on how much to spend for the rest of this fiscal year. And, you know, in the past, you look at these disagreements as, well, how much should we spend? And it's usually a difference of millions, hundreds of millions, billions sometimes even tens of billions. The difference this time over how much to spend from now until October 1st ranges from, on the Republican side, 60 billion, 100 billion, Michelle Bachmann, 300 billion, Rand Paul, 500 billion. I heard yesterday from an Iowa lawmaker, 1.5 trillion. After all, he said, that's the deficit. We want to balance the budget. We ought to spend what we're taking in. We have to cut $1.5 trillion. That's, by the way, all of non-defense discretionary spending and quite a bit of defense spending. Where are the Democrats on this? The Democrats, many of them, are deeply convinced that you do not cut anything in a recession. That's the time to spend more money. So if we have a starting point here of 60 billion and go out to 1.5 trillion, with the Democrats you head that way, as far as the eye can see, in terms of what we need to spend for more stimulus spending. So it is an enormous, I can't think of a historical time where there has been a budget disagreement this severe. And that's the easy question. The next question, which the freshman class hits end of March, beginning of April, is do we raise the debt limit above $14.3 trillion? They campaigned against doing that. Some of them are fully prepared to see the government shut down. They think it would even be a good thing at this point, that the establishment needs to be awakened. And now we come to the really difficult question: what to spend for the next fiscal year and 5 to 10 years out. And so you have a class, the establishment doesn't have time to co-opt this group. Now, they are, I have never seen a class like this before. It's going to be very interesting to see how they move over these three very big issues that will hit them very quickly. It's not as dramatic as street riots in Egypt. It's not really, in some sense, what Bob is talking about is a sea change. I mean, that's, this idea of, this concept of European unity has been the big idea since World War II. So if there's a new big idea coming. But what you're seeing in the United States is a rethinking of the whole enterprise of what government is and what it's supposed to do. And it's being done not by the usual suspects, not by the intellectual class, not by the elites in Washington, but by a very interesting, kind of newly empowered group that give every indication that they're not going away, and that 2012 could be every bit as interesting as 2010, even more so because there's the presidency on the line as well.
So a quiet and uninteresting time in Washington.
Uninteresting time in Washington.
You were talking earlier today when we were speaking to some classes about the difference between the different types. We were talking about politicians and the types of politicians. And you were talking about the difference between the show horses and the workhorses. And I think we all know that there are politicians who, one from my current home state, Massachusetts, is actually known as Live Shot. He always liked to be in front of the camera, whenever. There are politicians who love that kind of, and we know many of them now are very good at it, of directly communicating via Facebook or going on the air or being, great demagogues. Compare that with, and you've just recently been given an assignment to look at the 10 most effective people in the Senate, 10 most effective politicians in the Senate. To watch. Compare that, tell us about the ones who are actually have their heads down and are trying to do the work, rather than the ones who are kind of, showing us all their shiny baubles and trying to draw attention to themselves.
Well, there's an interesting group, some of you are probably familiar with it, called the Republican Study Committee. And it's been around for a while, and in the 12 years that Republicans had power before, they pushed hard to try to reduce the size of government. But when push came to shove, it was a president of their own in the White House, President Bush, and when he pushed for things like the prescription drug legislation, only 25 of them voted against him. And I was talking just last week with one of these members, and I said, well, what has changed with this 87-member freshman class? And he said, this time we'll have 40 or 50, and they cannot say no to us. And you've already seen some interesting things. This is Jeff Flake of Arizona, who's been pushing his whole life to get rid of earmarks. And he would go onto the floor of the House every single day, just about, and show one earmark with a silly name, the Christmas tree museum, in North Carolina. And that was the only one he ever got knocked off. And his colleagues would make fun of him because he was so focused on this issue. But as he said, earmarks, it's not just a problem of how much money is spent. It's a problem of a culture. That if you wind up spending so much of your time worried about adding something into the budget for your community that isn't competitively decided, you, by sheer force of political will, manage to get written that a highway will be built, not where it's most needed, but in your district, end of story. He said, once you get into that, you can be blackmailed. And so as the size of government goes up, earmarks were only 3% of the federal spending, but they dominated the culture because to vote against the big bill was to have your project taken out. And he said, by eliminating those projects, you eliminate the rationale for going along with ever larger spending. And you also eliminate the growth of lobbying in Washington. Most of the growth has been over earmarks. And if you eliminate earmarks, you're changing that dynamic as well. And so it's people like that that have picked an issue and have worked quietly within the caucus, trying to persuade hearts and minds, if you will. The Republican Study Committee was taken over by a man named Jim Jordan from Ohio. He was a wrestler, champion wrestler in college. He's not telegenic at all. But I noticed him at the first meeting this group had. The establishment Republicans, John Boehner, Speaker of the House, Eric Cantor, the majority leader, decided that yes, we promised that we would cut $100 billion from the current fiscal year, but the current fiscal year started in October, and so that's October, November, December, January. That's 4 months gone. So we can't really cut $100 billion. We ought to cut $60 billion. Those are the months that are left. And Jim Jordan gave a press conference. I don't even know why I went. Typically, they just go along with what the leadership says. And he said, we're not going to accept that. We're going to demand the full $100 billion of cuts this year and $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years. It was a thunderbolt. Because not only were you seeing an important rift in Republican ranks right away, but you were seeing a commitment to, that group went from 115 in the last Congress to 176. Now, they all won't stick their necks out to support this, but I'm hearing that at least 40 to 50 are committed to holding together on all of these spending issues, and to make sure, as he told me, we're here to help Republicans act like Republicans. When we act like Republicans, when we do what we say we'll do, we win, and when we don't, we don't. So this is not Michelle Bachmann. You couldn't pick him out of a lineup, right? And yet he is the one that I think is the most significant to watch, because he's at the heart of persuading those who are with him to stay with him, and persuading the leadership to figure out a way to absorb the Tea Party anger and aspirations before 2012, because he said, if we don't, we're going to be thrown out of office again.
So let's take another jump now. Let's go to Los Angeles, and let's talk to Gloria. Gloria, you've been monitoring the media, you've been blogging on the media, you've been looking at popular culture. Can we all just get along? Talk to me about what's happened since Tucson, and since even before that, since people started talking about whether the tone of the conversation that's going on in the United States is a little too hateful, a little too polarized. Have you sensed in watching the media and watching the way people are talking about things that there's a sea change going on, or is it back to the same old way of kind of polarized debate?
Well, given that we're talking in these sort of epical terms right now, I feel the need to frame this in something larger than just the last few weeks, and that's probably appropriate because changes tend to be cosmetic when they're in the short term, and you have to kind of look for the bigger trends behind them, right? So I thought maybe I would back up just a teeny bit and say that I think, because I need to get my epical comment in here. And I think that clearly what's going on in the larger culture, in the popular media, is this converging of the culture of entertainment with the culture of politics, so that the things that used to keep a more civic tone in when you were discussing weighty matters of government and civic interaction has tended to sort of bleed away into this larger chattering class that has evolved out of the pressures, the values, and the techniques of entertainment, whether it's radio or television or now the internet. So if you look at the way this has evolved over, I don't know, the decades, really, it tracks pretty closely with the explosion of new media. So that if you go back and, a few decades ago to the beginning of CNN, when there was really just the idea of a 24-hour news channel seemed foreign and odd, and people thought, well, who wants to watch the news all day long? They were in this culture of you tuned in at 6:30 or whatever, and you watched the three networks, and that was pretty much all people would want. And so as cable and all the other outlets began to proliferate, you began to have this bleeding of the values of entertainment, where this desire for ratings, this awareness that if you got up on a really, really hot personal opinion, by gosh, that got you just astonishing ratings. And so you kind of track over the decades the rise of the personality-based political commentator, political pundit, from Rush Limbaugh to Sean Hannity up through Glenn Beck, and as you have today, you just have this sort of disappearance of the lines between entertainment and the lines between what is political content and what is civic content. And so you have people like Glenn Beck saying, I'm just an entertainer. Don't I'm a clown. Don't pay any attention to me. And yet, the content of his show is deeply political and deeply involved with civic events, and culminating in a rally on the Washington Mall last year. And then at the same time, you have figures from entertainment, which I find sort of ironic, arising to actually be a counterforce to that. So you have Jon Stewart and Steve Colbert coming up and saying, let's have a sanity rally. Let's have an introduction of what used to come really from the other side of the aisle, which was sort of the political civic people trying to raise the level of discourse. And so if you fast forward to right now, looking at the civic discourse that over the last couple of weeks, clearly the shooting in Tucson brought the question of how we talk to one another, and how that affects the way we think about each other. And the whole discussion of whether or not the anger in our civic discourse actually led directly to the shooting in Tucson may not be the question. I think that the question that people are trying to raise is the larger anger and the larger inability to listen feeds a culture where everybody's talking and nobody's listening. I think one of the most interesting things, if you look on the internet, there's the figure of how many blogs, new blogs, come online daily is something like 17 million. So if you think about that, and you think in terms of, 17 million new people are inputting their opinion into the digital environment, you really have to ask the question: if everybody's talking, who is listening? And if you think of kind of the short term, whether or not we are having a course adjustment in this evolution of our ability to talk and listen to one another. Clearly, date night at the State of the Union, where you had Republicans and Democrats sitting together, at least gave a sort of a visual shift. And I think, as I sort of followed the commentary all week, it's clear that people were actually a little bit surprised that the gesture of actually taking just a pause, just a moment to consider what someone else might think before you either clapped or spoke or stood up, contributed just in a microcosmic way to an atmosphere of listening rather than just talking. And so I know John has asked us to think about, sort of more personal moments. And I will say, the interesting thing to me about having celebrities coming into the mix and having people from the pop culture side coming into the mix is that they are beginning to feed the culture the other direction. And I say that because, you had Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert saying, "Can't we all just get along?" And then you had Oprah Winfrey, who launched her own network, the Oprah Winfrey Network, which launched on January 1st. And a group of reporters, of which I was one, got to sit down with Oprah back a couple of weeks ago and talk about what she hoped to do with the network and what she thought was going on in the culture and how she felt she could affect it. And one of the first things she talked about was the need to cultivate this atmosphere of... Have I lost you?
Unplugged.
You there?
Yep.
I think my phone just died. Okay, so where was I?
Oh, you were talking about
The need
Oprah.
to cultivate.
Talking about cultivate, right. The very first thing she talked about was a desire to cultivate a culture of listening, because she herself had realized over her 25-year career of having a syndicated talk show that many of the mistakes she had made came out of a desire to tell people what to do or tell people what to think before she listened to how they were thinking or what they were asking or what they were interested in. And so as she was thinking about the programming that she was going to put together for the network as it launched, it's 24 hours of programming from sort of 0 to 60 overnight, really, launching a full network all at once. She was thinking about what it would mean to have programming going into a house nonstop, and what kind of programming would contribute to a culture of listening versus a culture of lecture or chatter or anger or just talking without thinking. And so she began to go through all the various shows on her slate, and she began to tinker with them, trying to orient them to this very simple question of, if I had this on in my house all day long, would it contribute to people toning down what they were saying, and would it contribute to people being willing to listen? And she said it was a very interesting exercise for her because coming off of a talk show for so many years, she realized, even though she had this sense that, I am Oprah and I know so much, I have learned so much, she realized that starting this new venture, she had to begin to learn and to listen all over again.
Interesting.
So,
very interesting. Okay, Gloria, let's hold it there. I think we probably want to go fairly quickly to audience questions. So I'm going to do just one thing, and I'm going to take a little commercial break here to give you an update on the monitor. We did this last year, and we might as well talk about the monitor because actually all of us, the correspondents, and all of the things that we're working on, that we're talking about tonight, we're writing about daily at csmonitor.com and weekly in our weekly print magazine. So let's just go through this fairly quickly. It's just an update on where we are because I figure you guys are interested. Here's where we were. That's actually 1908, and that's in front of where the monitor was published back then. Those are electric cars, by the way. So that's how modern we are. That's the Nissan Leaf on the left. Those are electric cars in front and then horse-drawn buggies in back.
Didn't they actually manage to deliver the monitor faster than the Postal Service did the last year that we were? Yeah.
And we've always used technology. So, here's our first airmail technology. We were the worldwide family news. Your worldwide family newspaper is being delivered via air freight. It was a big breakthrough for us. Here's Erwin Canham and his top editors putting together the daily Christian Science Monitor, probably in the 1950s, I'm thinking. There's the monitor. That's actually the last of the daily print monitors. In fact, there's a column on the left-hand side that introduces the new monitor, the weekly monitor. And that's the way we looked, of course. And then we made the leap. We made the leap to the weekly. These are a few of our covers. You've no doubt seen them. Weekly is a different, it's all the way that we used to do the daily monitor, but it has a little bit more of a news magazine quality, if you're familiar with it, if you're a subscriber. I hope you are, by the way. And we've tackled some tough issues, and I think we've been ahead of the game in some tough issues. Here's an Arizona piece that we did. This is the daily news briefing, which we launched also because we thought that a website is a very dynamic place to look at news, but there's still some value in taking a snapshot and having a hierarchical ranking of news. The daily news briefing is doing fairly well. We have about 3,500 subscribers to it. The weekly, we have about 75,000 subscribers to. Here's our website. Our website is a tremendous success. We have now about 6 to 8 million unique visitors. 2 years ago, we had less than 1 million unique visitors. It's growing really rapidly. And just some quick touchstones here. So this comes from some marketing material that I asked to just use in this presentation. But among news magazines, we're number 2 in credibility, according to Erdős and Morgan, the survey, and we have a 4 out of 5 credibility score by the News Trust. In other words, these are monitor values, credibility, creating conversations, identifying solutions, and we're carrying them on in this new media way that we've done for 100. We've done it for 100 years, and we've always evolved, and now we're in a new way of doing things. Here's where we are. We're in a thing called the Opinion Leader Network, and we're also in another network with The Economist. And if you look at the way we are within the range of opinion, this is commentary and editorial, this is not news, we fit pretty much in the middle between the conservative and the liberal side of things. In terms of national coverage and global coverage, we're fit in the middle, but we're actually a little bit closer as a news magazine to The Economist in terms of global coverage. The Economist, of course, is much more global than us. And in terms of online reach, we have tremendous online reach compared with The Week, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The Economist. We reach more people online than The Economist does. So we're in this network with these different news magazines, and we do combined ad sales now with them. In terms of global reach, it's maybe a little hard for you to see, but we have magazine readers in 77 countries. Of course, let's be honest, most of them are in the United States, but we circulate everywhere. We have reporters overseas, both staff reporters, reporters who are on contract, reporters who are frequent stringers or freelancers, and reporters who are occasional ones in countries all over the world. And we have visitors who come to our site from 236 countries. You can come to it from any country as long as you can get internet access. So that's where the monitor is right now. The research we've done shows that our readers are people who are more politically active than the readers of The Atlantic, The Huffington Post, and The New York Times. And that's pretty good, considering The Huffington Post especially. You've got a lot of motivated people on the left side of the spectrum. Thought leaders, 1 in 3 have been part of a group aiming to influence public policy. I mean, you guys, if you're a monitor reader, wherever you are active in your communities somehow. And many are community organizers. By the way, that's in the lowercase, not the job title term of community organizer. But you've served as a leader somehow with a volunteer organization. this is our story on the web. We've grown a mere 533%, and we've grown in unique visitors, more than 400%. So we are actually the #2 source for stories on Google News, and we're one of the 7 sources that Yahoo uses for news if you go to the Yahoo News page. So that's where we've come in the past few years, and we're trying to extend the conversation via social media, mostly via Facebook. We do tweet, and we are doing meetups, and we're using Tumblr also. And there's our headquarters. So thank you.